Great to be with you again on this Sunday as we continue the series that we began several weeks ago, which I've entitled The Paganization of America. I've lived through it from the days when Christianity was an accepted cultural norm. I remember being in the third grade and us having a Christmas program at the local elementary school where we sang all the Christian hymns, and they went through the birth of Jesus and had a little baby doll on the stage, and all the parents came to the event. And everybody thought that was totally normal. Today, that's not the case. We have increasingly come under the influence of what I've called, and I think rightfully so, the old gods, the pagan gods of old. We've talked about some of them, and again, the name is not important. They were known by different names in different parts of the world, but the characteristics of these gods were always the same. Baal, or Baal, as the Jews came in contact with him, was a god of prosperity. Everybody wanted to be successful, sacrificed to him, and sought to seek his favor. We definitely have a society motivated by greed. They say in the stock market it's controlled by fear and greed, and that kind of tells you a little bit about the whole economy. But God doesn't want us to be controlled by that, but he wants us to be controlled by love and by truth. And then we talked about Ishtar, the goddess of sexuality that was a deviant personality and encouraged all kinds of deviant behavior in the ancient world, and she's making a big comeback in our world today. And then last week we talked about the god Moloch, who was known for expecting people, if they wanted his favor, for them to sacrifice their babies on the altar of Moloch. And we talked about how in our society, unfortunately, the same ends have been accomplished just a little bit earlier for babies than in the time of the ancient Moloch. Well, today I want us to talk about spiritual warfare, because since these gods are real, we're not just interacting with other people that are misinformed or misguided. We're dealing with powerful spiritual forces that are at work in people, in society, and we need all the power of God to be able to engage effectively in countering the influence of these ancient gods. It's a battle for the minds, I would say, from a biblical perspective. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 3 through 5. For though we walk in the flesh, we're not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. So our world, just like their world, is filled with all kinds of ideologies and aspirations of individuals and things that they try to motivate us with, again, that appeal to our greed, appeal to our lust, or appeal to our fears, and only if we have the divine power of God can we really engage effectively in spiritual warfare. If we don't even recognize there's a war, then, of course, we are living on borrowed time. Imagine if we transported you today over to Gaza. You've seen the calamity over there, and it's still going on. Do you think if you're walking the streets of Gaza that you might be a little bit careful? You wouldn't just la down the street and, hey, let's go hang out with the Hamas friends over here. You would be very careful who you associated with. You would be ducking for cover because a real war is going on. And the Ukraine, the same thing, a little bit different type of war, but war is always, from a fleshly viewpoint, a terrible thing. Terrible things happen during wars. But we're fighting a war whether we know it or not. And the most dangerous thing, of course, is to not know there's a war and it's raging on all around you, and you're just acting like no big deal, nothing happening here. Where he said our weapons are not based on our fleshly power, but divine power. And then he illustrated by saying to destroy strongholds. In the ancient world, to some degree in ours, if you conduct a military campaign, there are strongholds, and they are at key points, and you have to take those in order to be successful in your military campaign. Of course, they were walled cities and strategic locations in the time of Paul or earlier. Today, our military goes in first with an air assault and knocks out all the communication links and all the radar. Now you make your enemy blind and where they can't communicate with one another. And then you move in for the next phase of conflict. Well, Satan is definitely trying to get this generation that you and I live with here in America today to not see things for what they really are, to not hear the Word of God, and instead to be full of the nonsense that is being promulgated as this is the way you should live it up, and here's the way things should be, that are all contradictory to how God made us and to what God's will is for us. But we have to be willing and able to think through what people are saying and to critically evaluate what's being proposed. You know, the biggest thing that I see in our culture is a loss of ability to think and common sense. I mean, there's some things that you don't have to be Einstein. You just have to have a little common sense, and you would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. And yet people are promoting some things that totally contradict all logic, science, and common sense, and they're with a straight face telling you, no, it's this way. No, it's this way. You have to accept this. We're going to force you to see things this way. And it was that way in the first century. The world was filled with pagan temples and pagan festivals and all kinds of strange beliefs that swirled around the early church. And Corinth was, of course, a major city of commerce, and all this was happening there as well. And he said, our battle is over the minds of people. If Satan can capture your thought life, you're his. And that's why we have to be so careful what we think and realize the battle spiritually is in many ways a battle for other people's thinking and their minds. For he said, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. But furthermore, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. One of the first things to be a good soldier is you have to be self-disciplined. Unless you're in control of yourself, you're not being emotionally driven, you're a part of a greater unit, you have your mission, and you're alert, then you can be a good soldier and not endanger yourself or endanger others. And our goal is not just to straighten everybody else out that's confused or messed up, but first of all, we have to get our own thought life in order. So the battle begins in here, not out there somewhere. We have to get our thinking straight and bring every thought captive to obey Christ. Not just good enough that's correct thinking, but that it leads to us obeying Christ. Because either Christ is Lord or something else is Lord in our lives. We have to decide who's going to be Lord. Then let's look at Ephesians 6, prepared for combat. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. We're not talking about you being strong. We're not talking about you gutting it up, you being tough. We're talking about being strong in the Lord based on divine power. In Ephesians chapter 1, he had already defined what divine power was. He said it's like what the power that God used when he raised Jesus from the dead. Now, do you think a power that can raise the dead is going to be powerful enough to empower your life in your spiritual conflict? Absolutely. However, you must seek God's power, not your own. If we try to stand against evil by ourselves, on our own, and on our own strength, we'll be overcome and overwhelmed. We have to be aware of the devil's schemes. Verse 11, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Now, he'll repeat over and over again this idea of standing, and think in terms of how battles were fought in the ancient world. Two groups would line up across from one another. One would march out, usually, the more organized military one, shield to shield, side by side, march across the field. And then the other side would get all riled up, and then they come running. And the goal was what? To knock down the people with their shields, to cause them to fall to the ground or to fall back. And so the most important thing to survive the conflict is you had to stay on your feet. You couldn't allow things to knock you off your feet. And so, right off the bat, if he talks about the struggle, he says you're going to need to wear the whole armor of God if you're going to be able to stand, because you are dealing with the schemes of the devil. The devil's a clever, scheming character. Look how he's brought back the ancient gods. And American society's like, can't see any of it for what it is, totally fooled, deluded, misguided, not fighting against it. You bring up anything about I think, what is it now? There's, I think it's in Oklahoma. Head of the education wants to bring the Bible back into the curriculum of history. And you'd think you're bringing the devil himself into to torment the little children of Oklahoma. They just think that's like the most dangerous thing you could possibly do. They're just, people are setting their hair on fire, running in circles over such a thing. But that's the devil's schemes. He gets it where your society refuses to expose itself to something that could change it, and instead imbibes all this false propaganda about living it up Satan's way. Well, this is all part of Satan's scheme. As we said earlier, clearly he's smart. What do? You go after the children. You don't go after the adults if they've already been deeply indoctrinated into Christian principles. You just try to get them to lay back, not be as intense about it, and then you take the children. You make sure they don't get exposed to Christ and God and the Bible, and you indoctrinate them with secular ideologies. And if you present Christianity at all, you present it as a problem. Well, the original conquistadors that came over here that treated the native Indians terribly, they thought they were Christians, and that's just all that Christians do. They go and rape and pillage and do terrible things. And so again, they take the examples, the worst possible examples of people, and then act like that's the only influence Christianity's had. But the truth is that our compassion for the sick and the weak all goes back to Christian, not pagan influences. But then he goes on further to talk about wrestling with forces of evil. Notice verse 12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. So behind whatever power structures or things that exist, there is a hierarchy of spiritual beings that are in rebellion against God and that are seeking to control, influence, as we've said earlier, possess cultures and societies and nations. And in the first century world, as the gospel went out, it faced a world totally in control of these pagan gods. And today, as they make a comeback, we're going to have to engage with them as well. Now, sometimes because certain human beings are more under the influence of the evil forces and are kind of their mouthpieces, their propagandists, we could think the problem is that person there or this person over here or somebody that's living very ungodly. Well, they're the problem. No. There's a much bigger source of trouble that ties everything together. And these are spiritual forces of evil that exist in the unseen realm but have power. I find it a little bit humorous. You notice how we're hearing a whole lot about possible aliens. But when they talk about it, they talk about phenomena that kind of appears like little globes that appear and that move through the air, different things like that. Trust me, if there were aliens as we've been told, they definitely would have let us know something by now. But instead, I believe those are manifestations of the old gods, because they've got power to concoct things and make things happen. That's how they gain control of ancient peoples. And so as they gain more and more influence, you see more and more manifestations of these powers. Like, what's going on here? Well, these evil forces have power too. They don't have a power equal to God, but they have spiritual powers. They can make things happen. They can cause things to happen. And they can work through people to create havoc in a society. So we have to never forget who we're fighting. Those unseen gods, Baal, Asherah, Moloch. We're fighting them. And unfortunately, they've captured a number of people. And therefore, these people, because they unknowingly have been captured by these gods, are advocating things that the gods, in revolt against the one true God, promote. And so we have to engage them in logic and common sense to try to help them think through some of this false thinking and misguided attempts to explain things, and instead offer a biblical alternative. But notice it says they wrestle against them. If a fight broke out in the ancient world, they tried to stand on their feet and to work as units to defeat an enemy. But ultimately, as the battle went on, it broke down more into one-on-one with one soldier against an enemy soldier. And when you do that, combat eventually ends up into a wrestling match, usually on the ground, where one person is trying to choke the other out or stab the other person in the ancient world. So you had to know how to wrestle. And so this is, if you will, the very personal nature of what spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare is not out there somewhere. It's in us. It's Satan trying to influence us. And we have to bring every thought captive to Christ and wrestle with our own emotions and desires and make sure that if they're not in sync with God's, that we don't allow them to control our lives, and that we engage with others, hopefully helping them to get in touch with reality too, and to grapple with these spiritual forces seeking to influence them. So he says to take up the whole armor. Let's notice what this entails in verse 13 and 14. Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness. So, again, think of yourself in the context of the first century world. We've all seen Roman armor. The breastplate not only fit the front, but went all the way around and protected them on all sides and their shoulders as well. They had to leave some room for the arms to move, so there's some leather that came down on the side. but it guarded the key elements of the heart, other that if a sword was to pierce would make a soldier instantly incapable of further fighting. And so the same is true here. We have to make sure that we are appropriately, spiritually armored, or we will be defeated and overcome by the enemy. And the whole thing here, of course, in context is so they can make their stand. The breastplate is of righteousness. And in the New Testament, righteousness has two elements to it. One is the righteousness of Christ, the undeserved favor and grace that God imputes to us because we're in Christ and considers us righteous beyond our own ability to do right things. And then it's the actual behaviors and attitudes that are right. That's what produces righteousness. And both of these things should come together. And if they do, they'll protect us from the schemes and attacks of the evil one. But we have to be willing to take a stand. And in the ancient world, the Roman army was most effective when they worked as a unit. So it wasn't like just some lone soldier, Achilles, out running wild, killing the enemy all by himself. That was not the Roman military method. It was work as a unit, and if they did, they were able many times to defeat enemy troops that were unorganized, disorganized, and chaotic. There were sometimes 2 or 3 times the number of people of the Roman soldiers. And so you have to be able to take your stand in sync with others. That's why we're part of a family. We're part of a church. And it's together that we withstand evil, not just individually on our own. And we have to do it with the breastplate of righteousness, but also the belt that holds it all together is the truth. Now, people that tell you, when you say something, they say, well, that's your truth. Now, my truth, well, let's put it this way. It's not a truth if there's more than one and they contradict one another. That may be an opinion, but it's not a truth. But you see what's happened in our society. They're trying to persuade us that there is no real truth. You make up a truth, somebody else makes up a truth. It's all just make-believe. But the Bible believes there is reality. That when the Bible uses the word truth, you could substitute in its place that which is real. That's the truth. And so if we're going to hold all our armor on, we have to have the belt of truth. Without it, without the truth, we are unable to hold our equipment on and will be subject to the whims of the enemy. And then, again, taking a firm stand, next couple of verses. And as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. And in all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, which can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one. Now, the Romans' shoes were very important to their success. What they did, they had very sturdy leather shoes with spikes in their soles, so that when they took a stand, they could grab the ground with that. A little bit like what football players have cleats on in order to get the grip on the ground so that they can run and move. Well, the Roman soldiers needed good footing. And that which we get our footing off of is the gospel of peace. So ironically, we're involved in warfare, and we're standing on the gospel of peace. But it's a peace through resistance against evil. And then he talks about the importance of faith. The ancient Roman had a kind of curved shield that went from the ground up to nearly their shoulder. They could put it down like this, or they could lift it up. And if the enemy shot arrows, one of the great dangers at which the enemy could attack you at a distance was shooting fiery arrows at you. You've seen some of those scenes in movies where they would take the work as a unit, the front people would hold the front up, and then the others would lift up the shield over them so that none of the arrows would hopefully get through. And so, fiery arrows of the Satan one, he's always trying to wound us and harm us, so he incapacitates us and then can take over in our lives. But it's faith, our faith, that protects us from Satan's attempt to harm us and influence us. So it's both the gospel of peace on which we stand and the shield of faith that we hold up. There's only one offensive weapon. Let's notice the next. And take up the helmet of salvation, that's defensive, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God.